So Peter, you're very welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Shay. I suppose most people know about the munitions strike through The Wind That Shakes the Barley, where there's that famous scene where your man Cunningham, the actor, is beaten up for refusing to take a train out of what was actually Killarney Station, where it was shot. But the interesting thing about the munitions strike is, despite being one of the most significant civic resistance events of the War of Independence, it never really got written up. And if you look at Dorothy McArdle's Irish Republic, it got half a page. If you look at the Irish Times supplement of last week, it got nothing. So things have gone down ever since. Ironically enough, the first decent history of it was in the Irish Independent. The Independent broke the story in 1967 in an article called Railwaymen to Find an Empire by Martin O'Sullivan. Martin O'Sullivan was a retired locomotive driver from Athlone and a strike participant, and he wrote a two-day follow-your-upper article on it. And one of the things he said was that he had written to the heads of history department of various colleges asking why this hadn't received any coverage. Bear in mind, this was 1967, a year after 1966, and those of us who are old enough to remember being in primary school will remember that there was wall-to-wall 1916 for the year of 1966. So there has been, if you like, a lack of treatment with some exceptions. Okay, who were the players? There were 28 private companies. They had been taken under government control in December 1916 in the face of the threat of an unofficial dispute by locomotive drivers. And this is the important thing, because it came back to bite the British during the strike. The compensation payments were based on 1913 profits. There was a big crossover between railway directors and the business elite. For example, Sir William Goulding, chairman of the Great Southern and Western Railway, was a privy councillor, a prominent member of the Southern Unionist Alliance, lived out in Sallins and had a background presence in the Curragh Mutiny. Frank Brooke, the chairman of the Dublin South Eastern Railway, was again a privy councillor on Lord French's committee, a member of the Kildare Street Club and a steward of the Turf Club. There were 4 big railway companies. I'm going to use the contemporary names of stations because that's what people know them as. The Great Southern and Western went from Houston to Cork, Limerick, and Waterford, and operated 1/3 of the system. The Great Northern went from Connolly to Belfast. Most of its system is now closed and spread across South and West Ulster. The Middle and Great Western Railway went from Broadstone to Galway, Mayo and Sligo, and the Dublin South Eastern Railway went from Pearse to Wexford and Waterford via New Ross. Now there were many other small companies, but it was the 4 Dublin companies, as they were called, that the strike was played out on. Just to go back to Sir William Goulding for a minute, he was, if you like, in discussions with the railway company in Britain. He was the shop steward for the Irish railway companies. The unions were the Railway Clerks Association, that's pretty obvious. ASLEF still exists, the Locomotive Drivers Craft Union. It had been making inroads into the NUR membership since 1911. The NUR was the biggest union. Its general secretary was J.H. Thomas, former locomotive driver, MP for Derby since 1910, general secretary of the NUR since 1916, and a privy councillor since 1917. J.H. Thomas, his political orientation could best be described as Empire Labour. The Irish Transport and General Workers Union also had a significant presence due to its presence on the docks. And of course, in the background was the Irish Labour Party and Trade Union Congress, which for clarity, I'm going to call Congress. Okay, the strike had its origins in a dispute in Britain. In April 1920, a ship called the Jolly George was in London docks bound for Poland with a cargo of field guns, and London dockers refused to handle it, and that action was immediately made official by their union's General Secretary, Ernest Bevan. British intelligence reports said at the time, quote, "Never have we known such excitement and antagonism to be around against any project that has been around amongst the workers by the possibility of war with Russia. On every hand, ex-servicemen are saying they will never take part in any war again." People were terrified that Winston Churchill would drag the United Kingdom into another war in Eastern Europe. Now, this was taken up by the National Union of Railwaymen. On about the 20th of May, in a speech in Derby about the United Nations, or the League of Nations, J.H. Thomas informed the meeting that his union that day had instructed its members not to load or carry or convey munitions heading for Eastern Europe. Now, what happened then, a couple of things happened. Firstly, William O'Brien, General Secretary of the Transport Union, had been in prison in Wormwood Scrubs and was released after a hunger strike. And he gave an interview to the Freeman's Journal on his return, in which he welcomed the fact that the London dockers had acted in solidarity with Poland, and suggested that he hoped they would soon find that there was duties nearer to home. So shortly thereafter, a ship called the Anna Dorette Boog arrived at the North Wall extension under the 100-ton crane and had a cargo of military lorries for the British Army. And a man called Michael Donnelly, who was an ex-citizen army man, well, at that stage a current citizen army man, walked up to Liberty Hall and talked to William O'Brien and Thomas Fordham, informed them of that, and suggested that the ship be boycotted, and that furthermore, if the British Army worked the ship, that the army movements to the port, to the deep sea section of the port, would be boycotted. O'Brien and Fordham agreed with this, and Royal Engineers worked the crane and unloaded the lorries. Now, Michael Donnelly worked in the deep sea section of the port, where then as now, the dockers are hired on a casual daily basis. The dispute then spread very shortly thereafter to the cross-channel section of the port, where the dockers were employed by the shipping companies. And dockers employed by the London and North Western Railway came across on the mailboat, the Slieve Moor, came across a crate full of revolvers destined for the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Now, what happened then was that they boycotted the ship, they were dismissed, and there was soon 400 dockers on strike. We can then follow the story to a guy called Christopher Moran. Christopher Moran was ex-Irish Volunteers. He'd been out in 1916, went to Frongok, and after he came back, he had a number of jobs, such as the construction of Collinstown Aerodrome and the Great Northern Railway in Malahide. On both occasions, he was sacked as soon as his background was discovered. He then got a job in the Dublin and South Eastern Railway. And as almost, if you like, as a 2-page appendix to his 15-page statement on the Eastern Rising, he describes how one Sunday morning he saw his roster, which was to go out as a guard with a locomotive to Kingstown to collect 22 wagons to be brought back into Dublin, around under the Phoenix Park Tunnel, and handed over to the Great Southern Western Railway full of munitions. This was a ship called the Paulberg, which had docked at the Admiralty Wharf in Dunleary. Now, the Admiralty Wharf gives the clue. It was owned by the Admiralty, so the stevedores would have been military staff. Moran describes, and you can go and read his witness statement yourself, he describes how he refused to do so. He said, "I'm not going." The first thing he did was he talked to other people. He talked to his 2 part-time union branch secretaries, and he talked to other members of the workforce who said, look, if this is an NUR directive on weapons for Poland, why should we be asked to unload weapons for Ireland? So Moran declined, and he says the next man in line on the roster, a man called Burgess, declined, and he was an ex-soldier. And he said, nothing happened to me, there were no disciplinary sanctions. And this is a key point, that there were no disciplinary sanctions, because the railway companies had a very strong line on any strikes, and they had an even stronger line on sympathetic strikes. The companies had fought and won a strike in 1911 on the principle of the sympathetic strike on a blacking goods, and they managed to sack 10% of strikers. And on this occasion, there was no disciplinary action. And there was no disciplinary action for this reason. We see here in April 1920 a telegram from the harbour master in Rosslare, which is still owned by Ardno there and was owned by the Great Southern and Western Railway, and saying that dockers are refusing to handle food exports unless it carries a label. In March 1920, the British decontrolled food prices, and there was a fear that this would lead to a rapid escalation of prices. There was a joint campaign by the Labour movement and by Sinn Féin to block food exports, and the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction brokered a deal whereby material cleared for export, particularly butter, would carry a label, and you can see this label here. And also the Department of Transport wrote to all the railway companies saying, in view of the delicate situation in Ireland, please don't do anything that will provoke a railway strike. So we now have the blacking of a strike, the blacking of military material, and no discipline. So just to step forward, there's 5 stages in the strike. In May, it's don't rock the boat, avoid a railway strike. In June, wait and see what comes out of the NUR Bristol Conference. I'll explain what the Bristol Conference is in a minute. In July, there were two contrary moves. On the civilian side, led by Lloyd George, prepare for mass dismissals. On the army side, the attitude was withdraw armed escorts from consignments of arms. And August to mid-October, it was a stalemate. October to December, it was throttle the railway system. Now, I can't talk a map. So if you want to have a look at this in some detail, go onto the RTE history website. And on May the 20th, there's an article I did in the Munitions Strike, which has a map, number one, of the extent of the railway system, which is about 3 times its current length. And number 2, the lines which were restricted or closed. The other thing to bear in mind, sorry, just go back one. Yeah, this is the British dilemma. And Hammer Greenwood, the Irish Secretary, our forces are still glued to the ground, and we cannot succeed until our mobility is greater than theirs. General Sir Neville Macready, the troops are now stationary except for the cavalry. So at the beginning of the strike, the British had 156 lorries in Ireland. They managed to load about 300 more, but the motor transport they had was reliable and short of spares. All the best vehicles had been sold off in 1990 and earlier 1920 by the Army Disposals Board. So the British Army was left with the dross. So we're now moving to what happened at the NUR Bristol Conference. The NUR was placed in a bit of a dilemma because roughly half the NUR membership were in Ulster and would have been unionist by political orientation. So the NUR, because this was an unofficial dispute run by Ireland and by the Irish membership and financed by the Irish Congress, what they tried to do was to get a conference in Bristol, which was a neutral venue with a common position. The meeting was held in late June, and the 3 motions were passed. In fact, you could argue it should have been a composite motion. The motion did 3 things. It congratulated the executive on their handling of the dispute. It suggested that matters in Ireland should be resolved by a cessation of what was called outrage, a cessation of army provocation, and a Dominion Home Rule settlement based on the recognition of the rights of minorities. Now, that led off into a series of engagements at the British trade union movement level in the Triple Alliance of dockers, miners and railwaymen, and led up to an intervention by the TUC and a special conference in July 1920. I don't have time to deal with that in detail. And there's a number, what I'm doing now is really scraping the surface. So to really get the detail, you're going to have to buy the pamphlet, which is currently in the works with the assistance of Umiskin Press and Irish Rail, and will come out in the near future. So buy the book to get the full story. So as we move towards July, and as the NUR conference doesn't produce the result which people expected it to do so, we're moving towards mass dismissals. And here we see a directive on the 29th of July, refusal of railwaymen to handle musicians. It's from E.A. Neal, who is the chairman of the Great Southern, the manager of the Great Southern Railway, but the standing of what was not the chairman of what was called the Standing Committee of General Managers, which was the body that administered the controlled Irish railway system on behalf of the Ministry of Transport. And you can see there what it says. If a servant, and this is great, the non-officer grades were still at this stage referred to as servants. If a servant concerned in the carriage of traffic should, in the view of the minister, be called upon in turn to do his duty, and in the event of refusal or neglect on his part, the next servant on the roster should be called upon to perform the work, and so forth. The same principle should be supplied in the case of any consignment of our passenger at any stage in the transit. You can see that has been put in inverted commas by, that's a Great Northern Railway file, and noted. Now, by this stage, the strike has spread. I mentioned Christopher Moore in late May. On the 1st of June, by that stage, the strike had spread to Northwall, Kingsbridge and Cork, where porters had refused to accept cartons of rifles. On the 8th of June, the first refusal occurred on the Great Southern and Western Railway proper, as in a train in Lucan, where a driver, Dunn of Inchicore, refused to attach 3 wagons to his train, which was carrying airplane parts to Oranmore. Lucan is the nearest station to Baldonnel. So by that stage, it's uncertainty as to what to do. There are mass refusals. Soldiers are turning up. In some cases, they're not carried and they go back to barracks. In other cases, they're beginning to stay on the train, and a policy of dismissals is ensuing. But here we see a cascading of dismissals, and that is being set up on the 29th of July. Now, on the 29th of July, that all changes. Frank Brooke, chairman of the Dublin and South Eastern Railway, member of the Privy Council, member of Lord French's Advisory Committee, and also a bit more of an executive chairman, because the general manager was only an acting general manager. Anyway, Brooke was sitting in his office in Pearse Station at 12:30 after a board meeting. And Western Road Station, or Pearse Station, was paid a visit by the squad. Paddy Daly, Jim Slattery and Tom Keogh went up to the office. Jim Slattery went into Brooke's office and shot him. And on the way downstairs, Paddy Daly said to him, "Are you sure he's dead?" And Slattery said no. And Daly says, "You better go back and make sure." So he did go back and make sure. Now, this rippled through railway management, as you might well expect. The aftermath was, and you can see here now, on the 12th of August, after a lot of toing and froing, Neil, on behalf, Neil reports to the board of the Great Southern and Western Railway, and there's oodles and oodles of these in the files. By this stage, the men are being dealt with on the disciplining procedure. The board decides at this stage, no further men are to be dismissed without a decision from the board. It's actually wonderful to look at the scribbled pencil notes on or on the back of letters, because sometimes they tell you more than the letter itself. So by this stage, things have changed rapidly. Now, I did mention the squad. The squad had a number of railway general managers under observation, and the intention was to kidnap them to try and mitigate dismissals. But according to another squad member, a further railway director made an approach to the IRA through the intermediary of what was known as a Jewess who ran a cigarette factory, to confess to his spying and to say he would spy no more. I suspect that that's a garbled version of a senior railway director trying to set up a line of communication with the IRA. And I suspect it's this guy, E.A. Neal, manager of the Great Southern and Western Railway. Because Neal was a man who was sent out to do meetings that didn't happen. So for example, a couple of years earlier, when the railways were saying, we will never recognise unions and we will never speak to them, Neal went over to the House of Commons on the QT and met J.H. Thomas of the NUR. So it is my suspicion that after the shooting of Brooke, the general manager of the largest railway company in Ireland set up a line of communication to Michael Collins. But proving that is a different thing. Now we get to the situation of Ulster. And we have this petition from the GNR, interestingly enough, from the loyal railway workers of Derry, as opposed to the loyal railway workers of Londonderry. And this shows the dilemma which faced both unions and management in the manifestations of the strike in Ulster. So that is in a way a manifestation of the dilemma facing management, because as we all know, all strikes end sometime and people have to get on with each other. But now you have half the work, or maybe 2/3 of the workforce, saying you shouldn't re-employ the other third of the workforce. What you can also see is the motions coming through from NUR branches in Ulster. So, for example, you have a meeting in Banbridge saying we urge the company to carry all traffic. We urge the company to act in the right manner. A similar motion comes in Ballymena saying the same thing and pledging unswerving loyalty to His Majesty the King. And then you have a motion from the Derry branch saying we support our colleagues who are refusing to carry munitions to slaughter our countrymen, and we refuse to be party to another Amritsar. Amritsar was the incident in, I forget which month in 1919, where troops under General Dyer killed several hundred people in the Sikh holy city of Amritsar. So we're dealing with the situation of Ulster. Interestingly enough, this placed, if you like, pro-Sinn Féin locomotive crews and engine crews in a difficult position in Dublin. And at the beginning of the strike, before it broke out on the Great Northern Railway, the Dublin Branch Committee of ASLEF met their manager and said, look, could you not just allocate all the munitions work to men from the Northern Division? This meant that, say, for example, on the Dublin-Belfast main line, Dublin and Dundalk men wouldn't handle the work, but Belfast and Portadown men would handle the work. That was refused. So you get a situation where the strike never really takes as much hold on the Great Northern Railway, and that in turn means that there is an attempt to enforce it by intimidation. Intimidation is a tricky one, because intimidation, people writing in the Munitions Strike have referred to intimidation as being IRA intimidation, and there was a certain amount of that. Of the 34 incidents of intimidation discovered by Eve Morrison in her thesis, 28 were on the Great Northern Railway. 6 were on the Great Southern and Western Railway, including one of the station master in Mallow, which is detailed in a witness statement, several witness statements. Interestingly enough, the station master in Mallow was kidnapped in order to, quote, give him a bit of a shock, which was duly administered. But he was kidnapped because he had a habit of, when work was to be allocated and it was coming up that there was military to be present and there were men going to be sacked, he chose married men when there were single men available to maximise the hardship. In a way, this shows you that the vast majority of supervisory grades who actually sacked people for the duration of the strike went untouched and unintimidated, and most of the, apart from the station master in Mallow. But there was a fair amount of intimidation by Crown forces, and this goes to the point made by Ewan O'Halpin in relation to the war in general, that there's an awful lot of talk about IRA violence in this period and very little talk about state violence. Richard Walsh, who was a shopkeeper from Bala or Castlebar and an IRA arms agent, gives an account of a 21-hour journey from Dublin to Bala with the consignment of arms hidden inside a goods wagon. But he also says, I have seen railwaymen being hammered by police and soldiers and refusing to budge, and it was an extraordinary sight to see the detachment of military lined up on the platform, fully armed, and those 3 or 4 ordinary workmen getting off and telling them that they would go no further. I have seen a man of between 50 and 60, a driver, being battered and kicked around the platform by a group of auxiliaries. So, if you like, intimidation cuts both ways. On the one hand, you have IRA intimidation. On the other hand, you have dismissals and you have intimidation by Crown forces. You actually have an account. There's a guy called Martin White, who's the grandfather of Alex White, the ex-minister, was a driver in Waterford, and he wrote in biographical piece for the Rail Record Society Journal, an account of him being dismissed. But the interesting thing is that the ledger for Waterford Locomotive survives. And Martin White has no dismissal recorded against himself for the period of the munitions strike. He has a warning issued to him in February 1921 for having too big a fire in his engine in Clonmel, but his dismissal goes unrecorded, and his dismissal goes unrecorded right throughout the personnel ledger, which suggests to me either two things. One, the company may have, in the light of the Brook shooting, rewritten their entire personnel ledger at some stage, or two, the company took a decision to dismiss people, but to say this is a particular situation and it's not going on their disciplinary record. We simply don't know. So going back again to the Great Northern Railway, a lot of people pleaded fear of intimidation. And in retrospect, that was a wise thing to do, because if you pleaded principle or political principle or trade union principle, your name would appear on this file. So, people who pleaded fear or intimidation were very wise. The company didn't believe it, because in an internal memo, the general manager talked about the people pleading fear or intimidation and said, in the vast majority of cases, these men have gone out of their way to embarrass the company. There are a few interesting cases. There's a question of driver Coulter from Dundalk, who arrives in Gormanstown, and bear in mind Gormanstown was the Black and Tan depot. And he says, a number of Black and Tans boarded the train. An intoxicated officer came to the footplate and asked me in a loud voice, would I carry them? I said I couldn't take them further than Dundalk, which is where I'm going. Driver Coulter got off the train in Drogheda and said, I'm not going any further. And his immediate supervisor, the running superintendent, says, the fault in this case was with the officer who made a very public request to the engineman in front of bystanders. Coulter was still sacked. You have a number of cases of kidnapping and intimidation on the Bundoran branch. What that has got to do with, if you look at it, is Finner Camp near Ballyshannon. Finner Camp is the largest military establishment in the northwest of Ireland. And there were 3 sets of enginemen required to work the Bundoran branch. And over a period in late August, 2 of them were kidnapped and 1 was intimidated. And the Bundoran branch was then closed. This followed down from what the Great Northern Railway did in September, is they shut large lengths of line in South Ulster. So for example, Dundalk to Enniskillen via Castleblaney and Carrickmacross was closed. The branches to Coot Hill was closed. And that was due to the amount of dismissed men. In a similar vein, the Londonderry and Lochswilly Railway closed the line from Letterkenny to Burtonport because they had sacked so many men, they ran out of men. This required the British Army to use the Navy to supply the Crown forces in northwest Donegal. I cannot overemphasize how bad the roads were in 1920. Up to the mid-1930s, when the plans were being dusted off to close the railways to Clifton and Achill, it took 2 years to get the roads up to scratch to take ordinary lorries. So, in a period in October.
Peter, can I just ask colleagues to make sure they're on mute, because otherwise we'll have sounds interfering with the quality of your presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jay. In the 10th of October, Mark Sturgis was a castle administrator who kept a diary. Mark Sturgis writes, I have been put in charge of a committee to throttle the railway system. So we're looking at throttling of the railway system, the ending of mail delivery, the ending of pensions delivery, and severe constrictions on the carrying of food. So the sequence is as follows. On November the 14th, Congress has a conference and leaves the ultimate decision to the railwaymen. November the 21st, Bloody Sunday, we know. November the 28th, Kilmichael, we know. December the 10th, driver Lawler, who's an employee of the Great Southern Western Railway, he's based in Lismore, he's a Dublin man, transferred out to a remote depot, is on his way home after work from the railway station in Lismore and shot by the military. The 10th and the 11th, the burning of Cork. The 10th, the declaration of martial law. And on December the 14th, the Congress Executive meets and recommends that the railwaymen accept, quote, anything the British are willing to risk on the trains. If the British had an insurance company, doubtlessly the insurance company would decline cover rather than the way that FPD have done in the recent pandemic. So on December the 21st, the NUR have an Irish conference. The motion is put for a return to work in exchange for no victimisation. It's proposed by driver Jack Kenny of Inchicore and seconded by a guy from Cork whose name eludes me. And there is a resumption of work the following day. There is no victimisation except on the Great Northern Railway, where the issue of victimisation and getting men back their jobs lasts out until 1922, and getting the issues of seniority and pensions lasts out until 1923. Congress Congress ran the strike, and Congress had a munitions of war fund which raised about 1.5 million in today's money. And if you go to the Congress reports, which are online in the National Archives, every Congress annual report from about 1904 to 1924 is online in the National Archives. And the audited accounts of the Munitions Strike Fund are available there. And it shows on a branch by branch basis how much money was given out, which allows you to heat map the dispute. So for example, the largest single amount of money went to the North Wall branch of the NUR. Naturally enough, because you have 400 dockers on strike from day one. The second biggest amount goes to the Limerick Trades Council. The third biggest amount goes to Rosslare NUR. Again, you have 150 dockers out. The fourth biggest amount goes to Waterford, where £10,000 in those days' money is evenly split between the NUR and ASLEF. And then if you go to the bottom end of the scale, you can see how the small effect of the dispute in the north. So for example, Belfast NUR received £75, which is almost the same as NUR Dunmanway, which received £72. And Enniskillen at 70 receives the same amount of money as Ennistimon on the West Clare Railway. And you really get some peculiar ones at the bottom end of the scale. Burtonport NUR gets £10. Glamworth, a thriving metropolis halfway between Fermoy and Mitchelstown, but very near to Kilworth Camp, gets £4 5 shillings. And where I live myself, the Terranure NUR gets £21, which I couldn't understand. But then I remember you have the Dublin and Blessington Steam Tramway, which would have served Tala RAF base. So, what were the options open to them? And it's, you know, there's a lot of whataboutery comes into history. And let's look at other munition strikes. In May 1944, the Dutch government in exile, in August 1944, the Dutch government in exile called for a railway strike in anticipation of the imminent liberation of all of the country by the Allies. Now, you then had Arnhem, the happy coincidence of sending paratroopers to parachute in on top of a resting Panzer division, and that worked well. And Seyss-Inquart, who was the Nazi Gauleiter of Holland, said, if the railways continue with their strike, the Dutch people will starve. The Germans imposed an embargo on the transport of food and fuel, and there was a famine in Holland. And that winter is in colloquial Dutch known as the Hunger Winter. And the famine wasn't really alleviated until nearly the end of the war in Europe. 1951-52 in France, the Confédération Générale du Travail tried to impose a boycott of munitions into China. And the French government responded to the dispute by shooting at strikers, by dismissals, to such an extent that the prefect of Marseille said that the CGT in Marseille had, quote, been decapitated. So at the end of the day, I mean, the munition strike is an example of civic resistance, but at the end of the day, superior military force will, in my view, almost always break civic resistance, as military force did to the Dáil courts as the war hotted up. Here are a few analyses of the strike. The first one is by a soldier, General Macready, a serious setback to military actions in Ireland. The second one is a historian, Charles Townsend, who wrote about the strike in 1979, which what was really under attack was the legitimacy of British rule. The railway's opposition to the British authority, which assumes governmental power in Ireland, was a notable contribution to this attack. The third one is by a historian and a soldier, an Air Force man, by Charles Couch, who's a military historian. The railway and dockers performed an outstanding service to the Republican cause, all the more so because they were non-violent. And the last one is from Martin O'Sullivan, the locomotive driver, who said they were not firebrand patriots or idealists. They were just ordinary working men carrying out their duties, but by their courage and unflinching stand, they showed how unarmed men can defy and halt a mighty armed force. And I suppose, you know, when the decision made by the Congress to step back, what came to my mind was the old Irish proverb, "Is far re ba no drohiasov," a good run is better than a bad stand. These are my sources. The GS&WR Secretary's file, it's high policy, it's correspondence between Sir William Goulding and his brother Edwards, who was a Conservative MP. The GNR locomotive files, which, to use that appalling contemporary word, they are more granular. They contain individual statements by individual drivers and firemen. Cavan and Leitrim Railway, a lovely little slim file by the general manager. The Cavan and Leitrim was a narrow gauge railway, unaffected by the strike. The military didn't need the railway, but at a point in October, they began to turn up, dismissals ensued, and the place was shut down. Bureau of Military History witness statements, and you can see them there. And you have the provincial press. I haven't dealt much on the provincial press. Again, most of my archival coverage is from the Great Southern Western and the Great Northern. I try in the pamphlet to bulk that out with the other railway companies to fill in the gaps. So there you go. Thank you for your attention. And if there's any queries, I'll do my best to answer them.
Very good. Well, first of all, Peter, thank you very much for that. It certainly was a walk through the fine print and the detail of a fascinating story. And it's probably very important in the current period of commemorations to recognise that the War of Independence wasn't always just people taking out guns and shooting people, but it was actually mass mobilisation and withdrawal of recognition from the state, eroding and undermining the authority of the government forces over an extended period of time. I have one question, but maybe just one comment in advance of that. I've been doing some work which Peter would be familiar with about Tipperary during the War of Independence. And there was a shooting of a prominent IRA member from outside Mullinahone on the Friday before Bloody Sunday. And the Tipperary football team were due to travel to Dublin on the Saturday. And 6 of those players were from Mullinahone. And in fact, there had been local talk about them withdrawing from the game in protest against the shooting. But since one of them actually had a pile of dispatches from the 3rd Brigade to bring to Dublin, they decided to go ahead. But when they were on the train on the way to Dublin, members of the Lincolnshire Regiment, who had actually killed the local IRA man, boarded the train, and a fight broke out and 2 soldiers were thrown out the window of the train. And the fascinating thing, which I could never understand, was how could a bunch of civilians in effect best a unit of British soldiers on a train? And of course the reason was very simple. The soldiers had no weapons. And it actually tells you the extent of, I suppose, the equalization of forces because of this dispute. And in fact, it was only when it was all over and the soldiers started carrying guns that the IRA then went to attack the forces of the RIC and the army while they were travelling on trains. One question occurred to me, Peter, at an early stage in the presentation. You listed all the unions that were involved in the railway system. And how did this work out with regard to inter-union politics between the different unions? And in particular, obviously, there was some territorial skirmishes about membership.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that, because the IRB set up the Labour Board in Dublin to undermine British unions, and they the Labour Board established what is now Connect, it's the Irish Engineering, Shipbuilding and Foundry Union. And the Labour Board targeted the NUR, but with conspicuous lack of success, for the following reason. This is the 8-hour day agreement of 1919. And you can see Ireland was at it in someone's hand. That's not the same handwriting as Stanley, President of the Board of Trade. Now, I remember being in a pub in Cork in about 1979 with a number of locomotive drivers and being shown this agreement and being told that the man who did that was J.H. Thomas, because he had been told by his father that when there was doubt about that agreement applying to Ireland, that a body of men went over in the mailboat and went to NUR headquarters, and Thomas said, no problem, and took out his fountain pen and added in Ireland. So as far as the majority of Irish railwaymen were concerned, J.H. Thomas could walk on water, despite his empire views. On the other hand, the NUR were under attack, if you like, not from a national perspective, but from a craft perspective. They were under attack from ASLEF. And one of the main spirits behind the movement of ASLEF was a guy called Frank Dempsey, who was a Sinn Féin mayor of Mallow. And we see him here, Driver Dempsey. He's looking to get his job back in 1922, and that's signed by Stephen O'Mara, the mayor of Limerick, because Driver Dempsey had looked for a couple of weeks' leave, I think in autumn 1920, to go to America with De Valera, and came back 2 years later. So from the internal union politics side, yes, the NUR did lose members, but to another British-based union. You made a very important point, Shay, and it wasn't until I got into the research, and sometimes it's not explicit, but the amount of soldiers travelling around unarmed the country before the munitions strike was huge. And that's your Lincolnshire Regiment at the time of Bloody Sunday. But from the point of view of the British Army, it was humiliating, because officers, for example, won a case in Sligo, the officer had to prove to the locomotive driver that his men were unarmed before he would take him to Enniskillen. There was a corporal who turned up in Waterford Station with a party of 28 men, and they wouldn't take him. And the corporal, which proves my point that NCOs run armies, went to the station foreman and said, look, my guys haven't eaten in 12 hours. So the deal was that the 14 that were unarmed got to go to Kilkenny, and the other 14 that were armed went to the barracks in Waterford. So there's a huge amount of unarmed soldiers and police travelling around the country. It's only after the munitions strike in February of 21, you see the big train ambushes of Upton, of Headford Junction, and of Rathcoole.
Okay, well, there's a note here from David Flood to say there's excellent fundraising postcard in the National Museum depicting a scene of a train driver refusing passage to the Black and Tans. So maybe when we can get back to the museum, that'll be worth a look at. There's a question from, let me see now, again, Terry Dunn asking what role, if any, did the Railway Clerks Association have in the dispute? And also, why do you think sometimes the witness statements are skewed in the way Christopher Moran's is, seemingly downplaying the munitions strike in which he played such an important role?
The railway clerks would have been involved. There's a couple of clerks who would have been in smaller station where a clerk would have been tasked with accepting goods. But say, for example, so somebody arrives up with a crate full of guns, but by and large, the clerks didn't operate trains. The people, but as I say, in smaller station clerks might have been, people who operated trains were drivers, guards, shunters, signalmen. And sometimes there was an amount of internal politics. Like there was a group of British soldiers in Fermoy who spent 3 days trying to go on leave to England to get a train to take them to Rosslare. And on one occasion they got on board, the guard refused. Now, the guard is in charge of the train, and somebody asked the driver, will you go? And he said, well, when the guard waves a green flag, I'll give you my answer. There was no guard and no green flag, so the driver got out of the firing line. But Railway Clerks Association wouldn't have been in the front line to the same extent.
And there's a question from Liam Cahill. Did the Waterford figure include payments to dockers as well?
I don't know. That the figure I'm quoting from Waterford is a payment to ASLEF and the NUR. There would have been other payments to the dockers unions, smaller amounts.
Okay, and Kevin asks, could you repeat the name of the director that lived near Sallins? And
Sir William Goulding lived in Millicent, Sallins, County Kildare.
okay, and what was the consequences of the strike for NUR and other railway unions in Ireland?
Well, none. The strike had one consequence, which was very dear to people's hearts, because although they didn't get written up in history, Schedule 7 of the Transport Act of 1944, which established CIE, deemed that any service of dismissal from a company taken in support of the national struggle between 1920 and 1923 would be deemed to be pensionable service. So any time dismissed, and some men were dismissed for up to 6 months, they would have had their service reinstated.
Okay, and Peter, Donald Denham says a fascinating and well-researched presentation, and he looks forward to reading the book. And he's inquiring if there was any involvement by engineering staff, either in Bala or in Mullingar.
There would have been the involvement of engineering staff in the railway was mainly confined to the repair of weapons or the manufacture of munitions. And in fact, railwaymen in general, and this is the same way in the French resistance in World War II, if some enthusiastic young railwayman is told, I want to join the IRA, he'd be told, stay in your job, don't associate with the local unit, don't parade, you'll be needed for logistics or if he's a craftsman, for making munitions. And there's actually a very amusing military service pension statement for 2 fitters in the tool room in Broadstone who were busy manufacturing tools for the manufacture of hand grenades. And they made the point that we had to work extra hard because we couldn't let our day jobs fall behind, because Mr. Morton, who was the chief engineer, was a very decent man. So at one stage you have the squad going out and shooting a railway director, and on the other hand you have IRA men saying we had to work extra hard at our day job because the manager was a very decent man and we didn't want to embarrass him.
Emmett O'Connor mentions that the reference to Amritsar may have been a dig at Carson, as he was a very public supporter of General Dyer. There's a number of colleagues online have said, thank you very much, Peter, really appreciate the interesting presentation. There's one query from Jim Quinn wondering where the GNR files can be accessed.
Well, at the moment, the GNR files can't be accessed because they're in the Railway Records Society and the archives is closed for COVID-19 and civil engineering works. But when things are normal, the munitions strike files, there's a hefty file on the munitions strike. There's also a file called Disturbances in Belfast 1920, Request for Police Protection. And there's a transcript of an interview between the company management and a group of loyalists in the Adelaide depot, which is near Windsor Park in Belfast. And the loyalists in the course of their discussion saying, no, we are not going after Catholics. We did not go after the Catholic engine drivers and firemen because they are working their trains and they prove that they are loyal.
Okay, and Donald again asks, would you have the names of the 2 men at the Broadstone that you just mentioned?
I can't remember. You're going to have to go on the military, on the MSP website, and you know it's a huge repository and it's fairly clunky. And you just have to type in something like Broadstone, and you know you'll probably get about 100 hits and go through them individually. Okay,
and Eddie Soy reminds me that a play was on in the Dublin Theatre Festival, and I think is still available on YouTube, that is in effect related to this story. It's called Embargo, and if I remember in the credits, Peter, you get a thank you from the playwrights.
Yeah, and regrettably, I didn't get to see that. I gather it's very good.
Yeah, okay, well listen, I think we'd said we'd try and get this finished well within the hour. I'd like to thank everybody for giving up their Saturday afternoon for what I think was a fascinating talk. Peter, you mentioned the booklet. When will it be out and how can people get their hands on it?
It'll be distributed to Umiskin Press, and we're working on the basis that it's going to be distributed online, by online, because I'm not working on the base. The bookshops are going to be open, but
Okay,
all that will be revealed in due course.
Okay, well, obviously, Kevin Murphy, as secretary of the society, will advise all members, and we can put it out and about how it can be accessed. I'm quite sure everybody would love to get their hands on a copy of it. Listen, Peter, I'd just like to conclude by thanking you so much. It's a great story. It's well told, and I think it's one of those pieces that was well pushed by the railwayman in 1967. The untold story of so many of those mass mobilizations in the War of Independence needs to be brought to the fore, as kind of history has developed the role of, if we can call it, everybody, the role of women, the role of people that were written out of the kind of the gunman script needs to be reclaimed 100 years after the events. So look, I'll wrap it up at this. I'll thank everybody for having joined this afternoon session, reminding you that we've two more that have been circulated by Kevin on Constance Markievicz and the motor permits dispute, and we look forward to them. And obviously then the society will take stock about putting more activities like this online. And I just want to say thank you very much and conclude at that.
Thank you.
Muted applause.
Very good.
Thank you.